So tonight, when you're with me, we're gonna draw eyes together. I think they're really cool. They're a lot of people's go-to doodle, I think probably because they have all these cool textures. Like if you look at eyes, they're very shiny, and that's kind of interesting. So it's not really just about how expressive eyes are, but they're just really intriguing. You have eyelashes, you have the watery middle part, you have all those little muscles in your iris. So they're really fun and kind of an interesting thing to doodle if you're waiting for a meeting or if you're just sitting around trying to practice your drawing skills. So what you're going to want tonight is probably a pencil and an eraser and some paper. I'm using a Prismacolor ebony pencil, and I'm not actually sure what kind of eraser this is. I just had it laying around my desk. Just one of those nice white plastic erasers. Oh my god. Uh, just checking on something for a minute. But if you want to try using a ballpoint pen, those are pretty nice because they show up really bold. So you can see the difference here between an ebony pencil and a ballpoint pen. It's a little bit darker, but you lose some of that detail with the pen depending how fast you go. So that's just something to keep in mind. I just used regular old drawing paper for this, but you can use any kind of paper while you're getting ready. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to turn the camera away from my face and I'll put it onto the drawing paper and I'll get started in just a sec. So I'm going to turn my camera and hopefully this will be graceful. We'll see. You get a lovely view of my ceiling fan. All right. Let's do some adjusting here. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit on my paper. Now, when you follow along tonight, you can do this in a couple different ways. If you want to try to draw your own eye and bring in a mirror, that's really cool. Or you can just kind of have a photo of your eye kind of next to you while you work, if that's something you want to try, if you want to try your own eye. Now, if you just want to draw my eye, then you'll get really good at drawing Ms. Cooper's eyes if you'd like to try that. Or maybe you're just going to hang out and watch. I know when I watch Bob Ross paint, I don't usually paint along with him. I just want to relax and watch somebody else make art. So you could totally use tonight for that too, if that's where your mind is at. So I'm going to zoom in on this as much as I can while my camera's on a tripod. And so what you'll notice about my eye is I did include some shading and other things. I think a lot of us, when we're used to drawing eyes, we're not always so sure about those wrinkles around the eyes. They can be kind of intimidating, and those details of the eye shape. A lot of people will remember to get that basic kind of football shape, but there's a couple other things to think about, like what happens in the corner of your eye? What about the folds around your eye? How do you do eyelashes without making them look like a big set of fake eyelashes? So those are the kinds of questions that I'm kind of here to answer while we're drawing the eye. So with that, let's get started on one of our first steps of drawing eyes. And for me, to help myself out, I have a printout of my own eye to look at. And the printout's a little bit dark, but that's okay, because mostly I'm using it for the shape of my eye, and after that, I know what it looks like, because I've had to draw my eyes a lot. So the first step when you're drawing your eye is to look very carefully at kind of the angle of your eye, or the tilt that it has. So if you look at my eye, from the inner corner to the outer corner, it's not straight across at all. If I hold my pencil, you can see the inner corner of my eye is actually much lower. So you want to look carefully at that diagonal that your eye might have. Now, some people really do have eyes that are kind of straight across, but that is not me. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of mark out where that inner corner is on my drawing paper. And then I'll kind of look at my photo and go on a diagonal, kind of like my eye does. So I'll kind of hold it like this. I'm not very exact and scientific, because I'm just kind of showing you how to draw eyes without going into a lot of detail. So I kind of angle my pencil and I just kind of move it over, and that's about it. I don't spend a lot of time measuring it out. So I'm going to draw that overall shape of my eye about this big, and then I'll be ready to go. So I'll give you just a moment to kind of pause, think about your eye for a sec, or mark off that little diagonal in there. Once you've got that diagonal for your eye, or maybe that straight across line, let's look at that overall shape of your eye. Now, every eye is going to be a little bit different, and I've drawn a few example eyes. But the way your eyelid is shaped isn't always a perfect, like, American football shape. If you'll notice, the corner of my eye tends to kind of pinch in just a little bit. And it has a different weight towards that outer edge of my eye. It's not perfectly even. Not all of that weight is in the middle. I've drawn an example eye where the eyelid kind of overlaps the eye itself a lot more. So there's a bit of a sharper kind of crease right here where the skin folds over on the eyelid. So you can look carefully at the shape of your eye or just draw along with the one that I'm drawing. So I'm going to do the top part first because that's the part that's a little bit more even, and it's just a little bit easier for me to picture how that works. So I'm going to move my paper just a little bit so I can get a better angle. I'm going to try to outline that part of my eye. And when you're drawing eyes tonight, if you're trying to draw your eye, but it's not looking like your eye or my eye, if nothing else, you have learned how to draw an eye. Even if it's not the exact one you're picturing, you'll still know how to draw eyes, hopefully a little bit better than you knew before, and feel a little more confident. All right, so now I'm going to get to that bottom part of my eye. Now it's going to poke in just a little bit at the corner, so I'm not going to immediately make my eye round. I'm actually going to keep it kind of flat, and then I'll round it out. So I'm going to kind of mark off the corner and then keep going. And you can see how I'm letting it get a little bit wider, but it doesn't get wider in the middle quite like that top part. Now I'm letting my lines be kind of fuzzy and light until I'm super confident about the shape of my eye. So I feel like it could be maybe a little bit rounder on the top, so I'm going to double back over some of those lines. I hear these called construction lines a lot. I think that's a great way to talk about them because it kind of shows that process of figuring out your shape that you're going for. So I'm going to go with these slightly wider ones. I'm going to take my eraser and get rid of some of those lines in the middle. Okay. So I feel pretty happy with that shape. I don't know that that's the exact perfect shape of my eye, but it's close enough for now. Now, something that's a little hard to see that you might have to look very closely at in your own eye, and I'm going to hold this printout really close, is you'll notice there's a lot of a shadow right here, but there's kind of an inside of your eyelid. Look at this area where there's no eyelashes. You also have that on the top of your eye. So if I were to look really closely, I would notice that my skin is actually slightly visible right here. It's not super visible, it's barely there, but you can see a little bit. Now, this might not apply to everybody watching. Some of you might have a fold of skin that folds over it anyway, so you actually can't see it. So don't worry about that if that's something that you can't see. And it won't be very visible later. And then on the bottom, you'll also want to kind of add in a line kind of right before your lash line starts. So I'm going to add that little line in there. And you'll notice there's not really actually like a hard line that you can see. This is mostly just me marking off where the eyelashes start. So as it gets past the middle of my eye, I'm just going to let that get lighter and kind of disappear. I won't really need it anymore after that. And from here, you can always kind of edit the shape of your eye a little bit. Like I'm going to bring this part up in the middle, and I'm going to erase some of those lines because I think my eye goes up just a little bit more. And the picture I'm using as a reference, I actually widened my eye a little bit at the last second because I was holding the camera really, really close to my eye. So that changed the way my eye looked a little bit, but it just makes it a little more expressive. Once you have that overall eye shape, this is usually when I start putting in the iris, or that round shape in the middle. So I'm going to look carefully at my reference, and you can too. And what I'll notice is that I don't see all of that iris, that colorful part. You can see it cuts off a little bit at the bottom. If you were to show the entire thing, your eye is going to look a little bit surprised or startled. So I'm going to cut off just a tiny bit of that part. Now I'm going to try to draw this circle as round as I can. It helps if you have something nearby and circular that's about the right size, but I don't have anything that's exactly the right size nearby, so I'm going to just try my best to get it as round as I can. And I'll zoom in a little bit. What I do is I usually kind of try to at least like mark out the 4 corners of where my circle goes so I can line those up. But mostly I just draw lots of little lines and just kind of slowly build it up until it pretty much looks like a circle. So right now it's looking a little bit flat. So I'm going to keep doubling over these lines, and I'm going to keep drawing them until it starts to look circular. And I'm probably going to need to pull out my eraser, so I'm going to keep these lines nice and light. I know we're probably all busy drawing right now, but if you do have something that's on your mind or a question, you can definitely leave that in the chat. So I'm an art teacher during the day, and I'm getting used to teaching remotely from school, so I don't see all of my students' faces at once. They can't like ask their questions to me immediately like we can in the classroom. So I'm actually getting kind of used to putting those delays in there and just kind of waiting to see what people are thinking about. All right, my circle is shaping up pretty well. Is it perfect? No, but it works well enough for this drawing, and you'll get the idea of what my eye looks like. I could maybe have saved a little bit more room for the whites of my eyes, but you'll get some better details on that middle part. So my last step here for this middle part is to outline my pupil. And in the picture, my eye turned out very dark, and the printout was dark. So you'll notice in my practice one, I actually made my eyes a little bit lighter. If you have super dark eyes, you might not notice exactly where your pupil is. So you can make that up a little bit. Now I start my pupil kind of small, and I kind of slowly circle my pencil until I've gotten a pretty good circle shape. Now a trick to drawing eyes that supposedly makes your eyes a little more attractive is making the pupils just a little bit bigger. So if you're trying to look a little more like cute or something, or make anything look cute, depending like who you're drawing, especially if you're like trying to draw something really cute like a pet or a kid, then you'll draw those pupils a little bit bigger, and that is supposed to make people look slightly more attractive. So I'm going to leave a lot of those lines in there right now, because I can always go back and change some of those lines and change that circle. But now I have a nice bullseye to aim for. All right, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see some examples that I've drawn up here. Because we're going to move on to those folds of skin around your eye. A lot of people talk about how expressive eyes are, and that's why they like drawing them. A lot of people are like, look me in the eye, look at the middle. But really, the middle isn't where the expression is. We could shade this all in, and we wouldn't really get any kind of feeling from that person. What's going to give your eyes feeling is adding in those creases around the eye. it gives you a better idea, of age, of mood. So I drew a bunch of different types of eye shapes. And you can see they all look a lot like that eye I just drew, but they have those wrinkles and folds in there that are going to make them a little more expressive. And so I'll zoom in on some of these examples. You can see this one has some sharper creases in the middle, and it splits towards the end. I actually have 2 creases in my outer corners too. Now some people don't have a big crease right at the top. Some people it just kind of goes out just at the very edge. Or theirs is just very even in the middle. Maybe it splits like mine. Maybe your eyes are set in your face in such a way that you have a wrinkle kind of right here that goes right over your eye. And maybe we can't even see your eyelashes. So these are all some examples of how your eye might look a little bit different. So it's something to think about when you're starting to draw your own eyes. Now in the case of my eye, my lid on the top mostly follows the shape of my eyelash line. You'll notice there's a very small wrinkle right in here. That's actually a little new. And then towards the outer corner, it's hard to tell because I have a lot of makeup at the outer corner, but it actually splits into 2 separate lines. So I'll hold up the example. Mine actually splits into 2 separate lines right here. So that's what I'm going to draw on mine. You'll probably notice a lot of things you have never noticed before about your eyes as you draw them tonight if you're holding up a mirror. All those like little wrinkles and lines and things that are making you expressive and that make you you. I didn't realize how different my eyes on each side of my face were until I was in high school. And I drew my eyes a lot because I was in some intro art classes. And when I drew my eyes, I realized my eyelids were very different shapes. My art teacher pointed it out and he had me come over and he was like, oh, your eyes are just different on each side. I later realized something was actually like off with one of my eyelids, so maybe that's not very encouraging or uplifting for you tonight. But it is an interesting thing, and I think that's partly why I'm so interested in eyes, is because drawing my own eyes actually pointed something out to me that I ended up getting taken care of later. So I'm not entirely satisfied with that top line here, so I'm going to change it a little bit and start it just a little bit early. I'm going to make it branch off right about here instead. I'm going to change where those lines go. I can always go back in with my eraser or blend it into my skin texture or just put some drawn makeup over the top of it later, because I do wear makeup anyway. All right, so my eyes should be getting a little bit more expressive. I'll just add one last little line underneath it. I don't have very strong lines underneath my eyes. Some people do. It indicates like some personality. I just don't have that under my eyes. I don't have a lot of it. I'm not saying I don't have personality, but it definitely doesn't show under my eyes. I'll give you a minute just to catch up, and then if you have anything you're thinking about or wondering about, you can drop that in the chat. All right, so I'm going to start adding just a little bit of shading to my eyes. Before I do, I'm just going to change the shape of this circle just a little bit. So my setup has my phone as my camera, but I have my laptop next to me, so I'm kind of seeing my drawing, but from a different view, and so I can kind of edit from there. If you don't have a laptop or anything next to you, but you have a person, you could always call them over and be like, hey, is this circle as circular as I think it is? We like some peer editing. This circle might take shape a little differently as I shade it, so I can always go back and change that. But we're going to move on to one of the parts that I think is the most fun, which is getting the actual shading done on your eye. This is what's going to make it look realistic and make it look a little bit watery and like it's actually set into your face. So if you look carefully at your own eye, or an example, you'll notice the white of my eye is pretty white over here, but it's actually rather dark, and you can even see a little bit of a line from my contact right there. There's usually, unless you have a lot of lighting from underneath, and it's at just the right angle, you're going to have a shadow from your eyelid. Partly just because your eye is round. It's a sphere, and then your skin goes over it. So I'm going to scoot my paper over. So if you picture your eye and you picture a sphere, right? When you have a big round ball, there's going to be some shadowing kind of off to the side. And I'm just going to scribble in this shadowing. There's going to be some shadowing where the light isn't. And maybe there's just a little bit of shadow at the top. Maybe there's not a lot. But once you add some folds of skin over that ball, it's going to cast a shadow over the top because it's round. And there's probably going to be a little bit of shadow on the bottom. Because really, your eye just sits there and your face moves around it. So let's go back over to that eye that we're drawing right now. We're going to add that shadow that's going to make our eye actually look round. If you've ever drawn an eye, or you've watched somebody draw an eye, and it looks maybe a little bit scary or a little bit surprised, it's probably just because it doesn't have that shading that makes it look round, and it can make people's eyes look open, maybe a little bit wider than they actually are. So I'm going to go in, and I'm going in pretty dark. I had a pretty dramatic shadow on my eye in the example photo that I took. And even if the shadow isn't actually that dramatic on your eye, you can always make it more dramatic just to make your eye drawing look really interesting. If you ever Google just eye drawings, you'll notice a lot of them are particularly dark with the shadows, and they maybe have a lot more contrast than eyes do in eye photos. That's just because when you're drawing it, it tends to look just a little bit more interesting if you add more contrast to it. Now, I know a lot of times when people, talk about drawing with pencils, they kind of say, work from light to dark, and I think that works in a lot of situations, but in here, I find it easier to judge the shadows if I start on the darker side. Now, the shadow on the bottom of my eye isn't nearly as dramatic, but it is there. Now, something that I haven't talked about yet, which is that very white part, is, well, why wouldn't you just leave it plain white? Well, if you think about the very brightest parts of your eye, it's really going to be where it's watery. That is the part that I tend to leave completely white, because if you look at this white compared to this one, there's actually a little bit of ink on this paper where it printed out. So when you look at a printout, it's a little easier to tell that, oh, maybe this area isn't as white as I thought. Really, the lightest areas are this area right here, some of these in the middle, and maybe a little bit on the bottom, because those are the areas that are wet. So I'm going to add shading just a little bit, very light. It might not even really show up on camera where you're at. I'm going to add some very, very light shading to this part of the eye, because it's going to make those shiny parts of the eye look that much shinier. And if this scares you a little bit, if you're a little afraid of going a little too dark, if you're not used to this, it's okay if you want to do that part later once you've kind of gotten a little more practice and control with your pencil. So I'm going to add just a little bit. Now, just to make my eye look slightly more dramatic, I'm going to leave one small part just a little bit white, just to make it a little interesting, because I can always add more pencil later. And I'll add just a little bit more in the corner. I'm making it a little dark, but it shows up on camera a little differently, so I'm realizing I can make this a little bit darker. And then from your view, it'll look exactly right. So this was actually the lighter corner of my eye that I just did. And you can see there's a pretty dramatic shadow on there. I'm going to move over to the other side of my eye and add in some of that darker shadow. Wow, my zoom just went wild. Look at that. All right, so you can compare those two sides. You can see what I'm seeing in my reference. So I'm going to just go super duper dark over here. Not quite as dark as the iris, but this is really one of the darkest parts of this whole image, including even parts of my skin, which, you know, isn't quite as light as the whites of my eye. So I'm going to put in this very dramatic shadow on the side. My shadow gets a little bit bigger in the corners of my eye. That's pretty normal, even if your eye is pretty well lit. That outer corner, at least for the shape of my eye, tends to be a little bit darker. I think that's probably, and this is me just kind of not really having a great basis for this, but I think it's probably because that's where my eyelashes are longer, so they cast just a little bit more of a shadow. But I'm not sure if that's actually scientifically correct. That's just why I would guess. So if you look carefully, my eye looks particularly round here because there are two highlights. There's one right here, there's one right here. So when I'm adding my shading in, I'm just going to very lightly, you might not even see these outlines at first. I'm just going to very lightly outline two little areas that I'm going to leave very white before I go in and add the rest of my shading to my eye. So this should make my eye look quite a bit rounder. And I'll add a bit of that lower shadow as well. There's not a very hard shadow, but it is there. And I feel like I'm making my pencil very dark, so I'm going to remind myself that I can always add more pencil later, but it's a little bit hard to take it off. So I'm going to make myself back off from that area for now, because I can always come back to it later. So let's work on that middle part of the eye now. Now this is where your eye starts to look a little less frightening. Right now, something about it is a little bit unnerving. So I'm going to work on that middle part. And I like to work on the whites of my eyes first because I think it's harder to judge those when that middle dark part is in there, at least when I'm drawing it. So I've seen people do both things, but I do find it easier to do the whites of my eyes first. So what I want to do first is I'm going to figure out how big I want my pupil to be and get rid of some of those lines in the middle and on the outside that are not as helpful anymore now that I'm starting to decide how big I want my pupil to be. I'm going to try to get one solid, almost perfect circle in the middle. And I'll show you a trick for if your circle is not turning out quite as perfect as you want to, where you're going to take a little bit of artistic liberty with your drawing. And I'm making my pupil a little bit smaller because I want you to be able to see that texture of the rest of the eye. So this lined up actually quite well, because this is something I tend to do if my pupil doesn't turn out super round. I'm going to kind of try to edit this circle as much as I can, but you can see my circle is a little bit flat and maybe not quite an accurate shape right here. And I got lucky, but I could always change this if I wanted to. That happens to be where a highlight is anyway. You can't see a defined circle where the pupil is. And I know some of it is just because the printout is dark, but even if it was, you can't tell the difference because there's a big highlight here. So if you are not so sure about the shape of your circle and you're not happy with it, you can just kind of put a highlight over it. So my highlight was kind of shaped like a window. It was slightly rounded and curved, so I'm going to make it have this kind of shape. And then you can just kind of work your circle around it. And then you don't have to worry so much about whether your circle is actually perfect. So now I can kind of finish rounding out my circle without really worrying about that part. We're just gonna cover that part up with a highlight. Now, if you make up too many highlights, it starts to look a little bit unrealistic and a little bit like a cartoon. But if you use that sparingly, then you can kind of get out of having to draw that perfect circle. Now I'll mark out one little kind of squiggly, oddly shaped highlight right here. And I'll draw it a little big, so if I accidentally cover it up, I'll be fine. And there's kind of a little one right here, and I'll draw it a little bit bigger than it is, just in case I accidentally cover it up. This is also something that makes your eye look round, because then you can see that these are slightly curved. Usually your highlights are at least a little bit curved, even if it was something very kind of boxy like a window. I'm going to go ahead and color in my pupil right away. And I can press really hard and do some harsh lines. Normally I kind of go in little circles like this. When I shade in the middle, I might go a little faster and use some straight lines. And I'm going to leave one slightly lighter area in my pupil as a little highlight, because I can always go back and change that later. It just helps my eye look round. And if I don't like it, I can always just cover it back up. I'll finish kind of rounding out my circle as well as I can. And then I'll move on to the iris of my eye, the colorful part. So now that I'm happy with my pupil, let's add that color. Now this part is going to be very different depending on the person. So if you have blue eyes, this is going to look very different than mine. I have lighter brown eyes. And if you have dark brown eyes, your texture will also look different. Now what pretty much everybody's eyes do is they're a bit darker on that outer ring of your iris, and I can say mine do that for sure. So I'm going to darken up that area. I can go ahead and define that a little bit. I don't use like the very sharp tip of my pencil. I use kind of the dull area. I'm going to mark out a tiny highlight at the bottom of my eye that makes it look a little watery, and then I'll keep going. A lot of people's eyes have a little tiny light spot right down there. That's something that'll make it look more realistic. So now I want to add those little lines in my iris. These function as kind of muscles, and I'm going to let my pencil wiggle a little bit. A lot of people try to draw really harsh, straight lines. And you can throw a couple of those in there, but really my lines are slightly wiggly if I look very closely, or if I take a picture of my eye and then I look at it. Now you'll notice I'm kind of spreading mine out. This is so that they don't crisscross each other. I don't shade in the entire eye by using these lines. If you do that, it tends to look like hair. I've drawn a lot of eyes that look hairy. I've drawn quite a few eyes that didn't quite work out. I'm going to try to avoid this eye looking too hairy tonight. So I'll just put in some of these lines just to kind of emphasize that texture, because that's part of what makes eyes so cool looking, is this texture here, and then the way people's color fills in. I tend to have more lines that are easier to see kind of in the middle, so I might add just a couple more kind of towards the center of my eye, and not so much towards the outside. So when I shade my eye and I go around that circle, I don't just fill it in with tick marks all the way around. because then it looks a little bit hairy. And I see a question in the live chat about, should these lines be really dark or maybe just a little lighter than the rest? That kind of depends on your eyes. Some people have very defined muscles in there, especially people with green eyes. Sometimes they almost show up as brown on a green eye. If you have super duper dark brown eyes, you might not really see these at all. It's just nice to add those in for some texture. So that's a really good question. So now it's time to add a little bit of shading, so your eye doesn't look like a radiating sun. What I'm going to do is I will start at the outside of the eyes and work my way in. And what I'm realizing is if I want these to be defined, I'm going to have to darken that outer ring. So for me, because I have brown eyes, I can darken this quite a bit. Maybe if you have lighter eyes, maybe you're just not going to darken that so much. Kind of depends on you. Or you can just give yourself dark eyes for today. So I'm going to darken that quite a bit. Then I'm going to drop some shading down from there and start radiating towards the middle. And I'll stop kind of partway through. You can see I'm letting it just fade out right about here. Because again, it's easy to add more pencil, but it's definitely hard to take it away, at least with the eraser I'm using. So I'm going to very carefully go around my circle and not add too much at once. And I'm so glad that Ninja Homie 7 added a question in the comments. If you have something that's on your mind, I would love to hear it and make sure that we're all on the same page. And if you're just relaxing and just watching the video, maybe you don't have questions about how to draw eyes, but if you do have a suggestion for the channel or things that you think you would like to watch, definitely let me know. And I'd love to do those in the future. I was a little nervous going live tonight because I've never done it before. And I was really hoping that my Wi-Fi would stay up and that everything would work. It seems like it's going okay so far, so I'm pretty excited to do more of these. All right. So you can see I didn't go very dark in the middle, and I'm also starting to run into that highlight on the edge, so I made sure that I didn't accidentally cover it when I got there. So I'm going to do something with the shading that's going to help make my eye look round. So I'm going to move over to this little side area where I talked about how you want to add a shadow to the whites of your eyes. Now that shadow doesn't stop in the middle. That shadow is still very much there in the middle of your eye, which means that however dark your iris, or the colorful part of your eye, is, it's going to be darker right there. So that's something that I'm going to keep in mind as I finish my shading. Now my eyes are brown, so I'm going to add at least a little bit of color to the whole rest now, but I'm going to keep it matching kind of that lighter value that I ended on. Because again, I can always add more pencil, and I probably will. And I might even add some extra towards the end since this shows up a little bit lighter on your end. I'm drawing extremely dark on my end. The light's bouncing off of it a little bit. So I feel pretty good about this. I'm going to go ahead and shade just a little bit more at the edges in a few areas, just to kind of round it out, make my eye look a little bit smoother, a little more consistent. I accidentally started covering one of my highlights at the bottom, but we'll just roll with it. It'll just be a different shape now. And you'll notice I saved the top for last because this part is a little different because it has that shadow. So I'm going to go in very dark, almost as dark as that pupil because it's a shadow on a brown eye. I'm going to add some darker values up there, where it's kind of hard to see the details in my eye, and that's okay, because some people have eyes where their details are hard to see anyway. So that's going to help with the realism of my eye and making it look just that much more 3D. Rounder? That's the word I was looking for. And I'll finish that shading right there just to make sure that highlight at the bottom is still pretty easy to see. Now, if you're somebody who's very detail-oriented, you might have noticed this already. But in my example highlight, and I'm holding this a little close to the camera and it's maybe a little hard to see, you see these little hairs sticking out there, which would be odd if you saw my setup. You would see that it's the window of my room. So why would it have these things? There's no plants out my window. What you're seeing here is the shadow of my eyelashes. So if you have a highlight like that, and you just want to have those extra details in there, you can always cut into that highlight with some little eyelash marks. And I'm going to make those fairly dark so that you can see them. And if you look up eye drawings in Google Images and all the ones that people tend to look at the most and the most favorite ones, you'll notice a lot of them have those little eyelash lines showing. It makes them exciting. Now, maybe something that's less exciting to me, but still important, is the corner of the eye, because it's got this highlight here that's going to make your eye look watery and round. Now mine is shaped kind of like a Pizza Hut logo, so I'm going to draw a vague Pizza Hut logo in there. And then I can shade around it. I'll keep a little highlight in there. There's usually some little highlights at the corner. I'll add my dark shading in there. And I'll let that blend out. And have my nice light area in the middle, making my eye look wet and 3D. I don't need to focus much on that, and I can always add some details in later if I want to. So now your eye should be shaping up to look pretty round, so now let's tackle that skin around your eye. I think it makes the most sense to work your way from back to front in space, because you can kind of cover up things as you go, but it's harder to kind of dig down through it with an eraser and put the details back in your eye, because you're going to end up putting eyelashes over it. Now this part I do pretty quickly. So mostly you're just taking those lines you already drew on the top and just making them darker. So I'll start with that by just taking those lines and just sharpening them up nice and dark with my pencil. I'll worry about the shading in a minute. So again, we're just using the tip of the pencil. You can always add more pencil later. It's a little hard to take it away. All right. I have that top shape in there, so now I'll go ahead and add some of my shading. And it really doesn't radiate out very far. These lines aren't very deep at the top, at least. So I'll just add a little bit of shading, but mostly my eyelid is pretty light colored in there. And I'm going to pretend that there isn't any makeup on it for a minute while we're drawing, just for the sake of demonstrating. But as I go towards that outer corner, the line really does get deeper, and my folds of skin get deeper. So when I'm drawing my shadows, those are going to get a little bit wider, a little bit darker. They'll spread out across my skin a bit more. And I'll move that shadow up top too. Again, it's a deeper line, so it's going to have a bigger, darker shadow that takes up more space on my page than that top area. And I even have some small little lines coming out there that are the lines in my skin. Pretty much everybody has those. So they're not wrinkles, they're just kind of the natural lines that are in your skin. I'm also going to go in and remember that little area of skin right here? The one that's kind of hard to see? I'll go ahead and shade that in too. So that area is pretty dark and it's pretty much all the same shade of gray. It's not super noticeable. And I'll add that on the other side too. Before I add eyelashes and stuff, I want to make sure I get some shading done. Now I'm going to zoom in, and this is going to sacrifice a little bit of the video quality here, but I want you to see the basic shape that I'm doing here, basic lines. So when I reach this skin at the top, this is probably going to be a little difficult to see, but you can see this is very difficult to see, there are little lines kind of crisscrossing each other at the top. So when I do my skin at the top, instead of kind of smoothly shading it, I'll add some of these lines that come off of my skin. I'll just kind of add some going this way. And then I'll add just a few that are kind of going back the other direction. And I'll make them really light, and I can always kind of darken them in a minute. If I'm trying to make it really dramatic, I can darken them a lot. But if I darken them too much, they look like wrinkles. So I'll err on the side of not drawing too many of these lines or making them overly dark. But if you look at how these build up, they do start to build up into lines that look a little bit more like a skin texture. And I'm going to draw these same lines on the inside of my eyelid. Now, one of these is actually quite dark, so I'm going to pull that out really dark. I was wearing very shimmery metallic eyeshadow when I took this photo, so you can really see every little fold in my skin in the original photo. So I'll make these dark because, you know, I can still show my shimmery eyeshadow. There's one deeper wrinkle right there on my eye, and there's another deeper one right here. These are just things that I kind of remember about my eyes. It just tends to fold a little bit more. It wasn't always like that. I kind of remember when it appeared. But again, I draw my eyes a lot, so I've noticed them actually change over time. It's kind of a cool experience. So that upper eyelid is coming to life a little bit more. Something I know about me is that it tends to be a little bit darker in that outer corner. I have some hair on that side that makes that side of my face darker. So this is ignoring the makeup and just making it darker. I'll add eyeliner in later and it will get much darker. Now let's move on to the bottom. This part is actually the simpler part, and maybe this part that you could have began with, but I think it's easier to understand how the skin works by doing the top part first. So I'm going to leave this area alone, the area that I defined with a line. I'm going to just add some shading in. Now for me, the underside of my eye is actually a little bit smoother. So I'm going to just try to do some smoother shading in here. And this is enough to kind of mark out that this part is different than this part here that actually touches my eye. This is also my chance to kind of deepen some of those lines without getting too detailed, because they're not truly very deep lines. They're just ones that I kind of notice on me. A lot of people have like a series of lines kind of And I emphasize those a lot so you can kind of see that shape. Mine aren't actually that dark, but hopefully that helps you to kind of notice your own. Like, oh yeah, my skin does crisscross a little bit there. So I'll go in and add some of that shading. All right. I'm happy with this for now, because I know on the bottom, like I've already gotten some practice on the top. I know I can go back in and add more if I want to. It's not going to be too hard, especially because I've done all this other complicated shading where I had to pay more attention to some of these details. I'll darken this part up just a little bit before I shade the rest of it. Now that I'm realizing I do have to shade this area, I'm like, well, I guess I need to make this part a little bit darker so you can actually see it. So I'll add a little more of that shadow underneath, and I'll let it get a little less smooth towards the outside to kind of show that I'm done drawing over there. All right, let's add a little bit of shading. And I'm going to start adding in my makeup as well, because I actually had a bit of eyeliner right here, and it was a little bit smudged. I'll maybe make it a little less smudged since I can have some artistic license with this and unsmudge my makeup. Now let's do some eyelashes. I'll start with the top. I think the top is nice because if you accidentally overdo it, it still looks realistic if you overdo it on the top, especially because people wear fake eyelashes. But if you overdo the bottom, it's a little bit easier to see. Now, when you make your eyelashes, you can practice this off to the side. It's tempting to just make little spikes coming out from your eye like SpongeBob. But really, our eyelashes aren't shaped like SpongeBob's. They are curved. And they're not always like this either. Mine, if you look at them, because you're seeing them kind of straight on, there's a little bend and then they go up in the air. They still go pretty straight up and down, but they're kind of like funky check marks. And if you wear mascara and stuff, you might notice that yours kind of go into little points. They always make little triangle shapes as they get stuck together. So if you get a clump of eyelashes, they'll be shaped a little more like that. So it doesn't hurt to quickly kind of practice that flicking motion off to the side before you get to your eyelashes on the top. I usually warm up because my number one mistake with my eyes is I add too many eyelashes or I make them too long. And they look gorgeous, but they also don't look real. Now, the other thing that makes people nervous is going over your eye drawing with your eyelashes, but that is okay. If you look at your own eyes, you might notice that your eyelashes do kind of swoop over your eye itself. So if you were to start with some of the outer ones, they might actually go over your eye. So I know you just did some hard work on the shading, but this is why we work kind of from front or from back to front. So we can overlap some of those things we did without having to go in and change details. Imagine having to draw all these little areas after you put in your eyelashes. That would be a little difficult. Now, if you want to draw some really funky eyelashes, you could have one kind of swoop dramatically across the middle. Maybe this is an eyelash that's falling out. And I've seen those before too, and some people's eyelashes naturally do that. Mine aren't super long, like some people complain about their eyelashes touching their glasses. That is not a problem I have. Or somebody with fake eyelashes, perhaps a little set of them is moving. And in that case, you might draw them kind of all over the eye. Mine overlap more towards the outer edge. I definitely, it looks like I have more there. I don't think I do. They just kind of overlap each other more. I'll keep practicing that little check mark. And because I don't see them straight on, some of the ones towards the middle corner actually kind of go the other way. Everybody's eyelashes are a little bit different, and maybe yours crisscross more. Mine are pretty neat on the top. When you get to the bottom, mine crisscross each other. Now, I know that I tend to draw a lot of eyelashes, and I don't want to go completely overboard. So I'll add in a last few because, you know, this is my drawing. So if there's any odd gaps in my eyelashes, I can kind of just make them not be there. I can make my eyelashes a little bit more even because it's my drawing. But let's move to the bottom. Now my eyelashes are a little more chaotic, and they follow that same kind of motion where they're not perfectly straight SpongeBob eyelashes, and they look a little bit long because I have makeup on them. If you don't wear mascara, maybe you'll draw yours just a little bit lighter. I do have one eyelash all the way in this inner corner, which almost doesn't look real when I draw it out. There's just a random chunk right there. And then they kind of start over again over here. So if you ever look at your bottom eyelashes, you'll probably realize two things. You probably have more than you realized you actually have. You actually, I think the numbers, you have around like anywhere between 100 and 200 bottom lashes. And if anybody fact checks me if I'm incorrect, you can let me know for sure. So the lower lashes are the ones where if you draw too many of them, it starts to look a little fake. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to draw a few, then I'm going to kind of back off from the drawing and see if I even need any more. So when I'm looking at it, this part looks pretty okay. It's pretty reasonable. I could actually add a few more at the outside, especially because they tend to overlap each other more. So I'll add a couple in over there. I feel okay with that. But I'll leave it there with the eyelashes. Now that you've seen some of the basic anatomy of the eye, I'll go ahead and add in where I know my makeup is. I'm going to darken this area quite a bit. You'll even see I kind of flare my eyeliner out at the edges, so I'm going to darken it a lot where I know my eyeliner is. Then I'll shade in some of my skin. Once you've reached this point, you've really hit all of those things that make your eye look like an eye. So I'm going to zoom out on mine. And all I'm going to do is just add a little bit more shading, just to kind of make it look more complete. If there's a little white area, I'll fill it in. But after that, I mean, you could sit there and kind of be really picky about your eye. But just by being here tonight, you've hopefully gotten some more practice drawing your eyes. Maybe you're an art teacher who showed up here, so you're probably already pretty good at drawing eyes, and you've probably taught people how to draw eyes, and you're just here for some practice. Maybe you haven't really done this much before, and you've picked up some new skills. Either way, it's just awesome that you are here on a Friday night picking up a skill or brushing up on a skill that you already have. And so if you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm not so sure about this. This doesn't really look like the eye I was trying to draw. That's okay. Just by being here, you've probably, helped yourself a bit. You've come here, you learned some things at the end of a long week. You still sat down and you're like, you know what? I'm going to practice something. I'm going to work on a skill. I'm going to go watch a video and grab some drawing supplies, or just sit and learn some new things. And that is super awesome that you've done that for yourself. I'll add just a little bit to close all of this off. Thank you for the well wishes in the chat. I really appreciate that. From Sam Muster and Ronan Elite. Thank you so much for coming. And for those of you who aren't chatting, but I know you're here, you've messaged me, you've encouraged me during the day. Thank you so much for coming in, for being encouraging, and for kind of jumping into this live stream with me. I appreciate it so much. I'll stick around and kind of just shade this for a little bit, and we can hang out, and I'll just kind of sit here and do some shading for probably another minute here. After that, it's time for you to kind of move on to other parts of your night, knowing something new. You can put this drawing on your fridge. Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you, Jake. If anybody has something that they'd like to see on my channel in the future or something you'd like to do, you can go ahead and drop that in the chat because I would love to know what you're thinking. I like hanging out with all of you. So definitely let me know if there is something you would like to see. But I'll go ahead and leave it at that. I'm pretty happy with my eye. I think it's time to go eat dinner. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody else who has commented in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and end this stream pretty shortly, but I'll just kind of talk about some things I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah, Ronan Elite just mentioned ballpoint portrait tutorials. So I recently did one. I actually still have the example on the table. So on my channel, I have one. I was making a really odd face. And this is done in ballpoint pen. So that video is pretty recent. I think in a lot of people, it's probably in their up next. But if you look really closely, I did this in ballpoint pen, and you can see all those little hatching lines. So if you're interested in those, I have those, but that's something I definitely would love to do live sometime. All right, I'm going to zoom on out on my drawing area. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and head out. I hope you have a wonderful night and happy drawing.